So let's put a Space Marine field cannon through its paces. How does the Firestrike Servo Turret stack up against the competition in 40k 10th? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd take a look at the Firestrike Servo Turret, the point defense tech marine turret of the Adeptus Astartes. These things started the edition kind of underwhelming, but Games Workshop did give them a point cut, and with that in mind I thought we'd take a look through their datasheet, any obvious buffs that the unit can be given, and then take a look at the damage breakdown to see how they stack up against the competition for other heavy firepower within the codex. Model-wise, the Firestrike Servo Turret is kind of a simple one. A heavy-duty point defense cannon when the Space Marines absolutely needs to hold a critical location, crewed by a tech marine gunner. I wouldn't say it's exactly the flashiest model within the Space Marine range, though I think it does its job for the role it's trying to fill. It definitely has the potential for some interesting use within the Space Marine army list, with quite a lot of their forces specialising in mobile, hard-hitting strikes, so a bit of static point defense might not be the worst, to pair with that and hold down your own deployment zone. I must admit I did find it kind of curious, the idea that this thing is supposed to slowly hover from place to place. Apparently those little pedal sort of bits are supposed to be grav plates, and the idea is that it can move very slowly across terrain and does have a movement characteristic in game. From the model itself though, I must admit I'm not really particularly convinced that it conveys that it really hovers around, perhaps due to those grav plates not really having much machinery or technology seemingly associated with them. I much prefer the idea that the tech marine gunner just gets out and drags this thing around when he wants to move it from A to B. As models go, the kit is really quite a simple one, not really too big or too flashy, and it was one of the ones that came out towards the start of 9th edition alongside the Invader ATV, perhaps ones that are aimed as simple and somewhat cheap expansions of a Space Marine army, and maybe not a terrible kit for people slightly newer to the hobby. Pricing wise, it's £22.50, €30 or $35, which is actually kind of surprisingly cheap for Games Workshop selling any one unit these days, even if it is a fairly simple individual gun turret like this. And the points that you get for the money invested is sort of middling for 40k at 2.2 points per dollar. Could be better within the Space Marine lineup, but it definitely could be worse as well. As ever, if you were looking to pick one up in your army, I've got plenty of discount affiliate links down below. Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, and Fenris Workshop in Canada all have it significantly cheaper than Games Workshop. And if you were picking one up anyway, those links do help support Auspex Tactics and keep these videos coming. Getting into the unit itself though, and the Firestrike turret is 75 points or 150 points for two of them. And as mentioned, while it does look kind of immobile, it actually does have a slow movement characteristic. It can move 3 inches. Functionally in game, that's not really going to help too much with gaining line of sight around terrain and things though. It's pretty much going to be where you put it from the start of the game if you want to keep on firing. Though it could be a bit faster in certain detachments that allow everything to advance and shoot, say the Firestorm Assault Force or Gladius for a turn. Those can give you some slightly weirdly fast Firestrike turrets moving around. Toughness wise, it's toughness 6, has 6 wounds and a 2+ armor save. For 75 points I'd say that's acceptable but not particularly standout. Basically durability that's going to be good enough to be resilient against small arms and gives you a chance of bouncing off anti-tank weapons with a high save. But if it takes too many shots from anything with mid to high strength and a good bit of AP, it's going to get killed fairly quickly. Ideally, it definitely feels like the sort of unit that really likes cover if it can get it, maybe not relying on its toughness that much for how durable it is, but rather its armor save to bounce off high AP shots with a good chance. Feels like a unit that would very happily deploy itself just at the corner of a ruin or something to nose into a little bit of cover. For the main event, it does of course get a big gun. As it's crewed by a tech marine, it gets to hit on a 2+, and perhaps kind of surprisingly there's no penalty to whether or not it moves, so it can have at least that 3-inch move of repositioning each turn if it wants. Not having the heavy keyword is perhaps a bit of a disadvantage for the Anvil Siege Force though, as this one feels like it should be a unit that's good for that detachment, but winds up not being as it's already hitting on a 2+. For the main weapon choice you get the choice between two, either a twin Firestrike autocannon, 3 shots at strength 9 AP -1 and damage 3 at 48 inches, or with twin links to re-roll the wound roll, or instead you get a twin Las Talon, 2 shots at strength 10 AP 3 and damage D6 +1, again with twin links, and that goes out to 36 inch range. Previously it used to be kind of close range. For damage comparison, to my mind I think it is really a win for the Las Talons. The autocannons definitely do a little bit more work against hordes, though maybe not quite as much as you might expect if they've got any sort of save with a 5+ or better, and they are a bit better against certain 3-wound infantry like Terminators with their high and vulnerable save, but not really so much that it's actually meaningful. Otherwise, against standard 2-wound infantry, and certainly things like rhino tanks or tougher tanks, the last talons massively win out. And I feel like with the premium that anti-tank sort of damage usually commands in 40k, there's not really too much contest, and the last talons win for me. I feel like perhaps something like a little bit of extra AP might have helped the autocannons compete if you were going for one or the other. Then finally for their datasheet they get their special rule which is called Sentinel Protocols. This one makes them extra good at firing Overwatch, so if you spend the 1 command point to use that stratagem on them, then they can hit on a 4+ rather than a 6. That is genuinely really quite a good boost to Overwatch, but at the same time it's still going to cost you the command point, and they are precious in 10th edition, so it perhaps kind of depends on what other plans you have for them in your detachment. But I feel like 1 CP put into maybe a unit of 2 of these with last hands actually isn't terrible damage depending on the target. If you're firing at something optimal, say like a toughness 9 vehicle with a 3+ save, you could average around about 1 or 2 failed save, so a theoretical average of 6 or 7 wounds there. But it's probably going to be overall more important if you could damage something that's just about to deal a lot of damage to you and basically get a big swing in the game. I guess if a somewhat reliable chance to land 1 last talon hit actually has the chance to finish off an enemy vehicle that's just about to light you up with loads of damage, then it could be a CP very, very well spent, even if the chance isn't guaranteed. It still maybe feels like a special rule that you'd want to use sometimes in game though, as opposed to something that you reliably just plug CP into every single turn. Overall, putting that all together, the Firestrike turret does have some fairly dangerous shooting that perhaps not hugely stand out for the cost, as we'll see in a damage comparison in a second. Out of the 2 turrets I will be tempted to use the last talons, otherwise perhaps the biggest draw is the option to overwatch fairly reliably, and that you can field them as cheap 75-point single models, which you can't do with that many other gunline units. The major downside I think is the speed though. Moving 3 inches a turn just isn't really very good in 40k. It's going to be competing against things like battle tanks that can move kind of fast and still put out a similar sort of damage output. So the slow movement is a bit of a downside if you're playing on a table with dense terrain and you can't get many lines of sight to things important. That's going to be a big loss for this thing compared with something that might have been able to move up to get that shot. Compared with most, I'd say it doesn't really have all that much unit synergy as well. A bit of a small unit for things like Tech Marines to bother supporting. Hitting on a 2+ means it's not as good with Oath and Moment, and it doesn't have infantry keywords which locks it out of some stratagems or being able to interact well with terrain. Basically, I think it needs to sell itself on raw damage and defense numbers alone, probably meaning it's likely going to be doing better in smaller numbers in army lists rather than being spammed, but could be reasonable enough to have some in a firebase alongside other units in a balanced army. Talking of unit support and buffing options, it doesn't really have all that much. As mentioned, Oath and Moment isn't amazing on it, given that it already hits on a 2+, you're only re-rolling 1s there, which is a bit less impactful than re-rolling hits on a 3+. And stratagem wise, I guess it might be reasonable to spend some on it if you've got a unit of 2. If it's just a 75-point cheap unit though, it seems unlikely that it's usually going to be worth the price of a mission to use anything on it. I guess Armour of Contempt could be pretty meaningful if you could use it. If you're getting shot by something somewhat high AP and you have cover, it could get you to save on a 3+ where you might have been on a 4. That perhaps feels like a Space Marine unit that's not quite as likely to get focus compared with some things that are moving up a bit more perhaps. Otherwise, I guess the other core stratagem option is Overwatch. I guess that'd be weighed up against your other options for the same. At least any hits are fairly likely to convert to wounds given the Twin Links rule and the high strength of the last Talon. Otherwise, it maybe doesn't really make good use of the other Marine Firepower synergy units. It can't really make use of Incursors given that it already hits on a 2. It won't care about the Combi Weapon Lieutenant as it already re-rolls wound rolls. Perhaps one of the most useful things might be the +1 to wound against vehicles. That could make it meaningfully better against Toughness 11 or Toughness 12 stuff. I guess a Storm Speed or Thunderstrike might come in handy then. Otherwise, briefly running through detachment things, as mentioned I feel like maybe the Firestorm Assault Force is one of the more interesting ones for it. At least that goes a little way to fixing the movement characteristics of it. It'll move somewhere between 4 and 9 and still be able to shoot. Not exactly super speedy, but could redeploy a surprising distance per turn perhaps. Ironstorm Spearhead seems fine, again competing against all the other vehicles. Re-rolling a single hit or damage roll does help quite a lot. I guess with its big heavy guns and coming in cheap units, it's one of the better things to actually make use of those single re-rolls. Mathing it out, and theoretically they add around about 25% damage increase to say if you're shooting against a toughness 10 vehicle. Re-rolling hit rolls on the last talons are quite impactful, and given that it hits quite accurately, there's a good chance you might be able to save that re-roll for a potential damage re-roll as well. Otherwise, Gladius could give a turn of advance and shoot. Vanguard Spearhead would be nice enough with stealth at greater than 12 inches. That would mean that it's even harder to remove at long range. Getting cover at that range could also help it just be a bit more flexible with where you want to deploy it. And as mentioned, I do feel like it's a bit of a minor sad point that it doesn't really do well with the Anvil Siege Force, not really getting much from being static, as it'd just be +1 to hit on a 2+ to hit anyway. Good for resisting modifiers, but won't be getting the +1 to wounds. Specific chapters don't really do loads for it either, I'd say. I guess it could make some use of the generic buffs from the Templar Righteous Crusaders or the Death Watch, but that's kind of the same as any unit out there. I was curious to see how the numbers for the Firestrike Servo Turret stack up though. Here are just a few competitors from within Codex Space Marines for things that fire at 36-inch range with anti-tank type weapons. A Gladiator Lancer, Repulsor Executioner, Ballistus Dreadnought, Predator Annihilator, and Missile and Las Cannon Centurions. I have made a bunch of fairly basic assumptions when comparing them, but I feel like it's not too bad for some rough and ready numbers. Interestingly, it does seem that the Firestrike Servo Turret Las Talons do actually have their niche where they could be argued to be the best Space Marine firepower. At least at this kind of range, they do seem to be the strongest at popping things like light vehicles like Rhino tanks. The Las Talons do seem to be pretty much perfectly suited to them, wounding them on a 3+ and then re-rolling the wound roll. Although it's not shown here as well, they will be really quite efficient against toughness 10 units. That's also one of their best targets to be firing at. Otherwise though, they're kind of mid against Terminator sort of profiles, and compared with some of these with strength 12 las cannons or greater, they won't really do as much work against the toughness 11 or toughness 12 units. Against those kind of things like the Centurions and the Gladiator Lancer do seem to have them beat, at least in terms of damage efficiency. Overall, despite having at least somewhat comparable numbers and some standout areas, I'd say that the Firestrike Servo Turret's damage output is probably a bit of a letdown really. It's not really standout tough for the cost with the amount of wounds that it has for the points, not at toughness 6 at least, and I kind of feel that given it doesn't really move very fast at all, it needs to have some significant advantages in the raw damage numbers. Otherwise it just makes a bit more sense to take things that are going to be able to move a bit faster. Between the trio of toughness, damage and movement, I feel like you're going to be hard pressed to sell these over things like the Gladiator Lancer or the Ballistus Dreadnought. And even things like the standard Predator Annihilator have very similar damage outputs per point against a lot of targets and can move quite a lot faster with higher toughness wounds. For units that don't move around so much, they may be competing against Centurions as well. They're also very slow and do seem to have better overall damage numbers here, and theirs get better if they get to shoot against something on an objective, which I didn't account for in the above chart. And I guess you'd also want to consider things like Eradicators. They might have significantly shorter range, but they also feel like they'd be not too far away in the same sort of ballpark, given that you could get a 75-point servo turret or go for a 95-point unit of Eradicators. Their damage output basically adds up to about the same or better than anything else on that chart, perhaps understandably given that you need to deliver them and get them in range. Overall, at the moment, I feel like that puts the Firestrike Servo Turret in a place where its numbers are just kind of fine. Taking 1 or 2 in an army list probably isn't going to hold it back too much. It's just going to be a bit more limited in role compared with the other models in your army, likely sitting around in the deployment zone as some baseline fire support where you have more mobile things to support it. They do have some selling points, being extra good against things like toughness 9 or toughness 10 armor. Good Overwatch if you want it, and being able to be fielded in very cheap units at just 75 points, but in reality they just don't really tend to get played in competitive lists due to less speed and the damage output not being better against a lot of the competitors, particularly against heavier armour, say with the Gladiator Lancer. I feel like overall at 75 points they probably are a little bit on the overcosted side right now. Even dropping a small amount to 70 I think would massively shore up their numbers against the competition. Maybe going down to 65 might actually get people seriously looking at them again and putting them in competitive lists perhaps. I still say they're usable at the moment, though I'd probably take them in small numbers due to their weaknesses. Maybe 1 unit of 2 or 2 units of 1 sat in your deployment zone. I'd probably aim to put them somewhere towards the edges and corners of ruins, somewhere where they can just peep round and then have good lanes of fire when they do so, and get a nice cover save on top of that 2+ armour. If they could taunt an objective and keep one held or do a bit of screening in your own deployment zone, then so much the better. Ideally want to be taking aim at optimal targets such as toughness 6 to toughness 10 vehicles where they'll be able to stack some very reliable wounds. With the 4 plus Overwatch, that definitely has an option for how you could spend your command points, and could be really huge if just one last talent hit is going to be enough to bring down a big enemy heavy hitter or monster just before it shoots or makes a charge. That could be a big swing in the game. It does feel like an option that you could use though, rather than one that would go out to use every single turn. Command points can do a lot of valuable stuff. If the opponent does counter-attack and maybe put some light infantry nearby, you could actually make these things a genuine nuisance by charging them if they don't have anything that could actually properly kill or damage them in that squad. You could basically lock them up, and then the Firestrike turrets might not actually care that much about being in combat. It can still fire out with a ballistic skill 3+, or even shoot at the things it's in combat with big guns never tire. I guess for other creative ways as well, you could potentially think about strategic reserving them as well. I guess that could be one way to near enough guarantee that you get some good targets for them to light up on turn 2, and set up 1 or 2 of these in a flanking shooting position later in the game. Let me know your thoughts on them though. Have you been putting any fire strikes on the table in your armies in 10th edition so far? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new Space Marine stuff quite regularly, and 40k videos come out most days. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel and keep more like this coming, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to check it out. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.